Jonathan Portis. He is a professor of economics and public policy at King's College in London. Thanks so much for joining us. Let's look, please, at the economic aspects of all this, and I'm just going to call it a mess right now. It's already cost the UK and cost the European Union, as our correspondent was talking about earlier. How much of an economic disaster could this become if Brexit continues to go forward with this much uncertainty and this much lack of clarity?
Well, as you said earlier, the consequences of a no deal, of the UK actually crashing out, would be very serious indeed for the UK economy. I think some of the numbers that you quoted earlier are rather exaggerated, but still the consequences would be very serious, and it wouldn't be good for the rest of Europe either. But equally, I think it's quite interesting. If you look at the foreign exchange market today, the pound has actually stabilized, and it's still, despite this week of complete political turmoil and chaos in the UK, the pound is still only a couple of percent down on what it was a week ago. So what does that tell you? I think it tells you that actually the view in financial markets, which is my view as well, is that ultimately there is not a majority in the UK Parliament for a no-deal Brexit, for us crashing out without a deal. And somehow that majority, which doesn't want a no-deal, will impose itself one way or another, regardless of whether or not Theresa May carries on as Prime Minister. I think the idea I think that her view, I think that only she can deliver this deal or a deal is frankly laughable at this point. She's hardly been terribly successful, but that there will be some form of deal, some form of extension or postponement, rather than a crash out, I think is still the most likely scenario, and clearly what the financial markets think.
You know, it's so interesting because you've actually highlighted how really unpredictable all this is as far as politically and economically. If the pound is actually stabilized, you say, in the midst of all this uncertainty, it kind of bodes well, I would think, for the Brexit process if they're saying, look, what a mess this has actually been, and yet our economy is still remaining stable.
Well, I mean, the pound is remaining stable. The economy has weakened, and there's no doubt that the uncertainty over this process will continue to be negative for the British economy in the short term. This is not good news by any means. But I think what the pound relative stability tells you is that although there is a huge amount of uncertainty, we don't really know what the way through this, that the really bad scenario, the no-deal scenario, where we actually crash out, despite the fact that there are some Conservative MPs who would very much like that to happen, that still is not the most likely scenario by any means. It's not impossible, but it's still a relatively low probability. And so while none of this is good for the British economy, the most negative scenarios appear unlikely to materialize.
Okay. Jonathan Portis, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us from London.